Hello and welcome to the 23rd installment of the Galen Data Medical Device Innovation webinar series. I'll be your host today. My name is Dwayne Mancini. I'm the CEO and managing partner at Project MedTech. Today we'll be hearing from Jón Bergsteinsson, which is most certainly not the correct way of pronouncing his last name, but he will correct me when he hops on, at Smart Trial by Greenlight Guru for a discussion on post-market clinical follow-up, or PMCF, and EU MDR. Some of the high-level topics we'll be covering are PMCF plans and general versus specific PMCF activities, what PMCF activities can be relevant, pros and cons of each, and selecting the ideal activity for your device. But first, a few housekeeping slides and some information on Galen Data. Galen Data is the cloud for medical device makers. The Galen Cloud provides a configurable platform for device-to-cloud connectivity that is compliant to FDA, HIPAA, and CE mark standards. Built on 40 plus years of collective experience developing compliant systems in the medical device industry, the company's goal is to make medical device cloud connectivity available to all at a fraction of the cost while shaving months off the development timeline. So with that being said, I'd like to now welcome our guest, Jón. Jón has a Master's of Science in Biomedical Engineering. He's the founder of Smart Trial and the Director of EMEA Sales at Smart Trial by Greenlight Guru, where he helps medtech companies bridging the gap between their device and clinical data. As the technical founder of Smart Trial, he previously served as the CTO, where he paved the way for the platform's quality standards, data security, and compliance. With a strong technical background and over 10 years of experience in clinical investigations, eClinical software, and medical devices, Jón is mostly occupied with sharing valuable insights from and know-how on clinical data collection with the MedTech industry. For more information about Jón and on clinical data collection, you can also check out episode 72 of the Project MedTech podcast, where Jón was my guest and we sat down and chatted about this. So that being said, Jón, the virtual stage is all yours.
Thank you, Dwayne. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here today. So today's topic, post-market clinical follow-up, is something that has been on everybody's mind, especially those that have products in the European market for the past couple of years. This is one of the notable changes happening in the regulatory environment in the European Union following the MDR. So a topic that a lot of people that have devices and devices to be put to market, which are now being transitioned from MDD to MDR certificates. The introduction that Dwayne made was very good, and I'm kind of just going to repeating a little bit from what he said. But like he mentioned, I founded a company called Smart Trial, which is now Smart Trial by Greenlight Guru. And I really got into the area of medical device data collection, clinical data collection 10 years ago, or a little bit more than 11 or 12 years ago, actually, when I was working in the clinic as a data collection expert. And throughout the years, I've had the chance to facilitate and support over 100 MedTech companies with the clinical data collection throughout the medical device lifecycle. And most recently, Smart Trial was acquired by Greenlight Guru, which is the leader of medical device or MedTech lifecycle excellence platforms, where we offer software solutions that cover the range of the medical device lifecycle, from strategy and product development to quality, regulatory, and clinical. Smart Trial is now the clinical arm of Greenlight Guru, and with our experience, we're combined 10 years of experience within the MedTech industry to create software solutions that are specifically designed for the MedTech industry. With our experience helping a number of medical device companies going from product development to markets to post-market surveillance and clinical data collection throughout that whole life cycle, we've gained a number of, we've seen a number of examples of how PMCF is applied in practice. But before we go into the topics of what PMCF means specifically in terms of practical implementation, we really need to take a step back and look a little bit into the regulatory environment of what PMCF really is all about. What is the real role of PMCF, or post-market clinical follow-up, under the European Union medical device regulation. PMCF is nothing new. It's been there in the MDD as well, Medical Device Directive, which is now phased out, and its focus has always been the same, to provide continuous overview of the clinical evaluation expectations of reality. Basically, it's a continuous effort from the manufacturer's side to observe how the device is performing on clinical and safety aspects out there in the market. The role of PMCF is included in the post-market surveillance part of the regulation. So the PMCF part of it, it's just one area of post-market surveillance. It's usually referred to as the proactive part of post-market surveillance because usually post-market surveillance tends to be covering primarily reactive vigilance or vigilance reporting in general, whereas PMCF is more focusing on manufacturers actively seeking information on their clinical performance and safety evaluation out there in the market. The goal of this is then to feed information into the clinical evaluation to be updated accordingly. So to achieve that, every single manufacturer has to have a PMCF plan available. And by stating so, I'm basically saying that all medical device classes, medical devices of all classes under the European Union regulation need to have a PMCF plan in place. Question of whether you have activities then initiated is another topic of discussion. A PMCF plan, I'm not going to say easy necessarily, but there is a template for it. So there's a clear description of requirement specification in the regulation, but also under the MDCG guidelines of what should be included in a PMCF plan. So if you look at it from that perspective, creating a PMCF plan is fairly simple, but implementing your plan or describing how you're going to be implementing that plan in practice is a completely different thing. Because throughout the past couple of years or even decades, companies haven't been focusing on PMCF as much as they maybe should, primarily due to lack of guidance and expertise. There were loopholes in the medical device directives in Europe that enabled companies to somewhat get away from actually conducting thorough PMCF activities. And with that in mind, we now have an industry that is seeking advice and assistance on how to conduct PMCF with few experts to actually accommodate that need. In addition to that, there are limited guidances available out there. MDCG, the group that was assigned by the European Commission to produce guidance documents and templates for the industry to facilitate the implementation of the MDR and compliance with MDR, have been diligent in trying to create documents that are helpful or believed to be helpful. But just as with any other political organization, things can take a lot of time. And often these documents tend to be non-legal binding, whereas you cannot take one of these documents and raise them up in court as this is how we were supposed to do it. So a lot of these guidance documents tend to be taken with a grain of salt as well. However, what we've come to realize is that notified bodies tend to keep a close eye on these and tend to use them as well for guidance. So with that in mind, if you have any questions on PMCF or other areas of the regulation, we tend to suggest that you should first take a look at the MDCG guidelines if there's anything. But with this lack of expertise and knowledge, people tend to have a lot of questions. And one of the most common questions I hear speaking to medical device manufacturers that are trying to plan their PMCF activities is whether they should conduct a PMCF study or a PMCF survey. There's a common misconception in the industry that a survey can solve all your problems when it comes to the clinical data collection. But what people tend to forget is the fact that clinical data is determined on how and whether you have completed your clinical evaluation according to the MDR requirements to date. So there's a lot of confusion and frequently asked questions about this area where people tend to forget about the aspect of clinical evaluation and focus too much on PMCF and where you're basically asking the wrong questions. What you should actually be doing is to look at your clinical data from a holistic perspective and ask yourself, do I have enough confidence in my clinical data? And here I'm not talking about clinical evidence, I'm talking clinical data. These are two different definitions. Do I have enough confidence in my clinical data to be able to comfortably state that my device is safe and effective? If I can, there's a limited number of PMCF activities I might need to initiate. However, what people tend to question themselves on, rather instead of asking the right question, is should I do a study or an observational investigation? Should I be doing a low and high quality survey, and how should I be initiating those? Is a registry the best way for me to go forward with my implantable device, or would a case series be more applicable? All these questions, they always go back to the same thing. Do you have enough clinical data in your clinical evaluation already that can confirm or document that your device is safe and effective in use? If so, the activities that you initiate in your PMCF should mirror that. But it is, well, like with any other regulation, it is difficult to translate regulatory requirements into a realistic plan, especially when we're talking about a new regulation, which is highly regulated by different competent authorities and regulatory bodies, like notified bodies as well, where few companies have actually managed to come through the loophole, get a certificate, and show that they survived. And this is where people start to shake, to be honest. And when I first sat down and was thinking about how to design this slideshow for today, I went back to a couple of these slideshows that I made previously 2 or 3 years ago in other conferences for MedTech medical devices. And I took a look at some of these slides. And the most informative slide that I tend to bring up as an answer to this question is always the one that I will be showing a little bit later. The slideshow about generic and specific methods. Because when it really comes down to it, what you should be focusing on in your PMCF plan is to describe the generic and specific methods that you will be initiating. And these methods that you will be initiating are determined on the level of clinical data that you already have that lives up to the MDR requirements. The trouble is that the regulation or the guidance documents, neither of them provide enough examples or accepted lists of examples that people can include in their PMCF plan. So what you really need to go with is, what is the industry doing? And what we have seen throughout the last couple of years, where companies are initiating PMCF methods, I tend to call them activities as well, is the following. Companies are still doing literature reviews because that's still a valid source for clinical data collection in a PMCF context, but also in a clinical evaluation context. Companies are initiating surveys in different ways. This can be patient surveys, clinical experience surveys, safety surveys with customers and hospitals. These can be patient cohorts where you're comparing things from one time point to another. Case series where you're simply asking physicians or users or clinical experts to provide cases on or reports on individual cases in a limited manner. These could also be clinical investigations or studies where you're either doing comparison or observational investigation on your device. Registries, which can mean different things, but here I'm actually referring to third-party registries that are, for example, initiated by public authorities on implants, for example, and investigator-initiated studies, investigator-initiated trials, or investigator-initiated investigations are also a valid source of clinical data for PMCF and clinical evaluation. However, when we get, by hearing this, you're not really getting an answer to your question, which is, should I be doing a study or an investigation? And to be honest, there is no real answer to that question because it all depends on a number of different things. However, what you need to understand is that depending on which activity or method you will initiate, you will be able to produce different levels of clinical data. General methods tend to be methods that are not necessarily initiated by yourself or your company, and might sometimes lack the strength of clinical or scientific arguments that are needed to confirm safety and performance. However, many of these general methods can be very, very powerful when used together with other specific methods. And the reason why I think the regulation is going into details of these two, specifying general, specific methods have to be documented in a PMCF plan for a medical device, is because of the fact that if they wouldn't, a lot of companies would probably just go ahead with initiating a bunch of surveys, which a lot of the times can be considered generic or general, or companies might be relying too much on general evidence coming from the literature, which is very much not specific, because it's often competitor devices or other kinds of similar equivalent devices which you don't really have any access to in terms of data. Specific methods, when compared to general methods, are methods or activities that you're specifically initiating as a manufacturer. This can be in collaboration with sites or customers, but these are methods that you're specifically initiating to gain or collect clinical data that can be used for PMCF and clinical evaluation. The difference between these two tend to be mostly on the level of clinical evidence that you can gain from them, because as soon as you're initiating specific methods that you're full in control of yourself, you not only usually have access to the data, which is required, but you also have control of the quality assurance, which is very important. So looking at it from your perspective, which method is then best suited for my PMCF plan? Well, again, like I said before, it depends. And what you need to look at to be able to determine which activity fits your device best is by looking into these 4 boxes here and another 4 boxes that I'll show you a little bit later. Depending on which device class and what kind of risks are involved with your device, you can or might have to initiate, for example, clinical investigations to collect the data needed. And this might be simply because it can be difficult to conduct a survey alone on a high-risk implantable device, active implantable device, for example, because there are only 1 or 2 cases a year where it's actually implanted in a human being. Your sales numbers and target markets are also hugely influential on what activities you can initiate, because if your sales numbers are too low, again, mirroring a little bit the device risk class, if they're too low, you might not have enough cases out there in the market today to be able to collect enough data to be able to demonstrate safety and performance. Depending on the existing data that you're including in your CER, again, if you're using clinical data in your CER that's coming from an equivalent device or a similar device, you have to remember that in Annex 14, there's a very specific requirement that states that clinical data used for equivalence, a manufacturer must be able to demonstrate access to clinical data that's used for equivalence. So if your existing data in your clinical evaluation reports is all based on equivalence data, you might need to initiate your own clinical investigation to be able to confirm those assumptions that you're making in your clinical evaluation. How you measure performance and safety is also a huge factor that needs to be taken into account. If you measure performance on your device by using a method which is not a part of standard practice, and you need that method to be able to measure your device's performance, you might need to initiate an interventional clinical investigation to gather enough clinical data to either confirm what you laid out in your clinical evaluation report, or what you need to comply with in your PMCF plan. When it comes to performance and safety measurements, this can be done in many different ways. But it's just crucial to note that the way that you measure the way that you collect data on performance and safety can be very different from one device to another.
Jón?
Secondly, yeah.
Quick question. Someone had come on and asked what kind of PMCF activity can be undertaken for a new device entering the market. Do you want me to hold that for later, or does that tie in now?
Let's hold that up. We can take that as the first question when we go to the Q&A, because it relates to another question that I know we're going to be answering as well.
Yeah, excellent.
Thanks. So another 4 aspects that you need to take into account when you're evaluating which PMCF activity or plan method you want to initiate is whether you have contact to end users or patients or not. Having contact to your end users is crucial to be able to ask them clinical experience questions, for example. It's a crucial factor if you're going to be looking towards collecting proactive vigilance data on your device, which is, by the way, one of the requirements of PMCF. Proactively asking your end users and or customers about vigilance or safety issues. How the devices apply to practice. Is it solely bought off the shelf from a patient and used at home? Or is it something that requires implementation of a clinical expert in the clinic? These 2 different use cases can greatly impact the type of clinical data, the clinical data that's collected, but also the method or activity that's initiated. If it's an off-the-shelf product that the patient can use or apply themselves or implant even themselves, you might not need to initiate any studies that involve clinical experts, for example. You could, for example, rely on cohort data from patients directly. Does data constants exist? Here I'm actually referring to the European Union regulation on data protection. Sometimes data processing constants exist in the clinics that enable third-party manufacturers or third parties to access clinical data anonymously. If those constants exist, this could be a nice way for you to gather the right data. However, we have seen that some companies that have tried this have found out that the data that they need often doesn't exist in the journal systems, for example, or registries. And then lastly, your reporting requirements. If your reporting requirements for, now this looks a little bit off, but I'll try to talk through this. If your reporting requirements for PMCF are to be updated every year or every 2 years, it's not enough to start 6 months before your certificate expires. When you hand in your MDR application, notified bodies are expecting a full application. And you can't just go past that by simply handing in a half-finished PMCF plan or a result from a half-finished study collection. If you do not have the necessary scientific evidence to confirm your intended use or performance parameters, you might be at risk of being denied certification. This is highly impacted by, for example, how often you need to update the PSUR, or how often you need to update the SSCP, for example, for your device. So when you go about selecting the applicable method, there are a couple of things to keep in mind on what pros and cons there are to each method as well. So based on these factors that I mentioned before, with that knowledge, if you've gathered that knowledge about your product, you could now potentially determine which PMCF method to use to reach the goal that you need for your PMCF. So literature reviews are still very relevant, and I think all manufacturers should still continue doing those, because you are getting a lot of data on similar equivalence devices and clinical experience data on similar devices that can be very helpful for your device. Investigator-initiated studies are very helpful because they are cheaper oftentimes than initiated studies or studies that you initiate by yourself. But you have to make sure that the compliance for good clinical practice are in order, and that the intended use or the data that's collected in the study mirrors what you're looking for in your intended use. For example, if the investigator-initiated study is solely focusing on parameter that doesn't have anything to do with your performance and safety, you should not include those study results necessarily about your product in your clinical evaluation report or PMCF report, because it might even it might cost you more. It might cost you simply trying to support that and not getting anything out of it. Third-party registries or registries that are initiated, for example, by public authorities or other organizations can be very helpful if the data within those registries, again, mirror your use or intended use or your clinical performance and safety. Again, you also need to make sure that the quality assurance is in line with good clinical practice, because otherwise you might risk that data not being able to be used for PMCF. Interventional clinical investigations are most of the time needed if you're looking for long-term data. For example, if you simply cannot provide access to clinical data to determine long-term performance and safety of the device because it's based on equivalence to date, you might need to initiate interventional clinical investigations. For example, if there are too few sale numbers, or you're needing interventions in the clinical workflow to measure those parameters. Observational clinical investigations, or private registries, as I like to call them, are becoming very, very popular amongst companies that need to follow patients in time, whether it's 2 or 3 days or 6 years. A lot of companies are initiating observational studies with minimal data collection requirements. Solely the focus of those should be to collect performance and safety data. You're not doing research anymore. So there's a lot of companies initiating those observational kind of clinical investigations, registries, to get the data in that they need. The big factor involved in that is the number of cases out there in the world right now. So if you do have too few sales numbers, too few cases, observational studies might not be the way to go. Case reporting are also becoming very popular for 2A devices. So here I'm referring to class 2A under the EU MDR. These are particularly devices that are, for example, accessories or a part of a larger device, or short-term implantable or point of use devices, where the data collected is very limited and only at the time of use and nothing else. You do not need to follow the patient in time or anything like that. Surveys or cohorts are also becoming very popular to support higher level evidence in activities. Surveys are becoming very popular amongst companies that have existing devices out there in the market. They have clinical data on long-term use and safety and performance. So they're simply looking for evidence to confirm, to continue confirming that. They're not collecting evidence to demonstrate that. They're collecting evidence to confirm that what they stated before is true and applies in reality and out there in the market. Patient cohorts are also becoming very popular amongst companies that have a direct patient contact, or patients are included in the treatment workflow themselves, where, for example, companies are able to reach out to patients directly through their own sales channels, or even through their own devices, if it's a software as a medical device or anything like that, where you need to collect data over the course of a couple of days or weeks to be able to determine the performance and safety of your device. This can be helpful instead of conducting an interventional clinical investigation, whereas you're simply relying on the questionnaires to being completed by the patients and not involving clinicians in the clinical workflow itself, in the questionnaire workflow or the data collection workflow. So another popular question before I wrap up my last few slides here is about the sample size calculation to be included in a PMCF plan. So one of the requirements that are depicted or should be depicted in or answered in a PMCF plan is sample size. People tend to look at PMCF as one activity where the sample size is your market size, but that's not the case. Sample size calculation should be done for individual activities. What that means is that if you're initiating a survey, you should create a sample, calculate the sample size for that survey. If you're initiating a clinical investigation, there's a sample size calculation for that investigation. If both of them are a part of your PMCF plan, both of those sample size calculations and documentation and justifications on parameters that you use in your sample size calculation should be included in that. So it's very important that when you when you're touching upon the topic of sample size calculation for medical devices, that when you justify your results, that you include both clinical and statistical assumptions. I'm not going to go into detail of that today, what that means, but simply stated, it is not enough to state that you calculated the sample size based on the power of 80% and alpha of 0.05. That is purely statistical factors. You're not including any of the clinical assumptions. Sample size calculation relies on both areas, and both of them need to be justified and documented in your sample size calculation justification. So with that, I'm gonna leave you with a take-home message, which is included in our ebook that we just published a couple of days ago, and I believe you'll get an email with the link on how to download that after this webinar. But like I mentioned before, and like Dwayne said as well, I'm very active on LinkedIn. So if you're interested in getting more information on Smart Trial or hearing more about the content that we're generating and publishing every week, find me on LinkedIn and let's connect. And feel free to send me a message if you have any questions on this topic. Otherwise, I think we should go into Q&A, right?
That sounds great, because I can tell you that this is the most pre-submitted questions I think we've ever had. So there's a lot of good questions, and you know, just to make sure it's super clear, can you please say your last name for everybody, the unbutchered version of it?
Jón Bergsteinsson.
Perfect, excellent. So let's close the loop on that one question that I piped in for at the beginning, just on what kind of PMCF activity can be undertaken for a new device entering the market, just to be super clear, just to address that one. Yep.
So a new device to the market doesn't tell me a lot. So again, like I mentioned before, to be able to determine that, you need to understand what kind of device we're talking about. If it's an implantable device, you need to initiate some kind of a observational activity, because usually when it's an implantable device, you need to follow patients' time. If it's a device with a lower class, which is usually like a single use or a point of use kind of device, you can often implement some kind of activity that just relies on single time point of data entry, and these could be something like case series reporting or case reporting, sometimes even called in the industry patient-specific surveys. So again, it depends a lot on the different factors that I mentioned before. So there's no real answer to this, but I think what I shared should provide some guidance in determining that.
Perfect. And so just as a reminder for everyone who's listening in here, if you have questions, feel free to submit. As I say that, we get one coming in. I'm going to ask one though, Jón, from the questions that came in ahead of time. So the first one we got was, is it necessary to have an ethics committee approval for PMCF trial, which does not bring additional burden to the patients? And then I guess it's a two-parter. Do you want me to save the second part till after you address that?
So the first part, this depends on the country that you're initiating the activity in. So for example, in some countries in Europe, if it's a CE mark device and you're not intervening at all, you might not require ethical committee approval or competent authority notification. Some other countries require both.
Okay. And the second part of that was, can I perform questionnaire surveys in hospitals? If so, what's the difference from observational PMCF trial?
So the difference is primarily in the fact that if you're initiating a PMCF trial or initiating a PMCF investigation, it's usually a point of like a following time kind of a setup. If it's a survey or a single point of time data collection, that is usually considered a survey in that regard. So as soon as it starts following somebody over the course of a time, recruiting, visits, follow-ups, stuff like that, it's usually considered a trial or investigation. But again, it depends a lot on what you're trying to accomplish. If it's CE mark device and it's purely observational data and it's single point in time data collection, it could be also considered a case series. So it's the terminology there is very different from what you're trying to do.
Okay. Could you provide a good reference for basic sample size calculations?
Oh, so I wrote an ebook about this a couple of years back. So if anybody's interested in that ebook, it's called the Medical Device Sample Size Cookbook. It's available on my LinkedIn, as well on our Smart Trial website. I think that would be a good read for everybody that's trying to get a hold of that topic.
Cool, very good. Another question is how to generate CIV ID for ongoing clinical investigation of legacy device. Is it mandatory?
Yeah, so it's great that I got this question in before the webinar, because there's an MDCG guideline from the European Commission that actually addresses this. So let me send everybody a message here. Okay, I just sent you a link on the chat. I don't know if you see it, but the MDCG guideline from last year, 2021-20, addresses this specifically.
Perfect.
Yeah, Paul
it
submitted a link to that.
It is in the chat there. So Jón as well as Paul both posted in. Awesome. So another one from a question we just got in, actually from a former colleague, Lindsay. It's good to see you as well. How do you take into account a very rare disease state for PMCF plans?
Rare disease. So if we're talking custom device here, there's a lot of depends in the medical device regulation about how to tackle that.
Okay.
Bear in mind, I'm not a regulatory expert in the sense that I'm not advising companies on how to design their PMCF plan. I'm purely talking about my experience in terms of what I've seen from companies conducting PMCFs. So I'm not able to answer that in a manner that would suit his company. Yeah.
Okay, very good. One of the questions that came in beforehand is how to perform PMCF activity for low risk device and higher risk device, which I think you kind of covered a little bit, but Annex 1 GSPR checklist, all points are addressed from PMCF activity. What in case of similar devices is available in market? Can we take some data from lab without investigation? I read that word for word. I know that doesn't make a great deal of sense, but does that make sense?
Yeah. So low risk devices tend to be less focusing on conducting or collecting data in time. So low risk devices tend to be something that you use occasionally or just very limited. So for those kind of devices, you can often rely on case reports, case series alone to gather enough data. For high risk devices, it depends a lot on what kind of device we're talking about. And most of the time, you need to conduct some kind of an observational or cohort like a study or method or activity. Okay. Related to the similar device available in the market part of the question. So bear in mind, if there's a similar device out there in the market, you can't just use their statements as is. You need to have access to the data. And if you're going to be producing that data by doing it in the lab, I don't have enough knowledge of the type of device to be able to state whether that's okay or not. But if you can demonstrate that technically it's the same, biologically it's the same, or biocompatibility is the same, and clinically it's the same in the lab without touching a human, and produce your own data and apply it to your device, then I guess according to regulation you can. But it's very difficult to take a device in the lab, not apply it to a human depending on the device, of course, and state that it serves with clinical performance in the same level as your own. I mean, then you maybe should just take your own device and test it in the lab.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good point. And another clarification on the previous question I had asked, I don't think it was not custom as much as it was low incidence rate, right? So I think that's where that was coming from the original question I asked. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so when we're talking about those kind of devices, few sales numbers, stuff like that, you most definitely will have to think about initiating some kind of an interventional investigation. Because if you're going to try to get your product to market with only 1 or 2 use cases, but there are actually maybe 50 cases out there in the world, You might need to initiate some minimal activities depending on, your discussions with the notified body. They can help you determine that. But when it reaches that stage of expertise, you often have to get some feedback from your notified body as well on that.
Okay, great. Question that just came in is, do you have to justify sample size for general PMCF surveys?
So if you're conducting a survey, yes. If the goal of your survey is to state that all my clients and customers that are using my device, they love it, you need to determine the sample size in one way or another. You can't just simply state that 20 is enough or 10 is enough. The sample size needs to be based on scientific justifications. And if your scientific justifications rely on you being able to state, or would like to state that you can demonstrate that everybody's happy, there are mathematical models to be able to reach that result with a sample size of X. So that needs to be done on an activity to activity basis.
Okay. The next question is in relation to electromagnetic compatibility perspective. Is it necessary to take into account seriously during the EMC testing as per IEC 60601-1-2?
Yeah, so when it comes to electromagnetic compatibility, that's just one thing. When you're talking clinical, that is a whole different area. So you can't just simply state that because of electromagnetic compatibility, it's equally stable, equally effective. It's not touching upon clinical. So that standard, the IEC that is referred to, that specifically talking about electromagnetic compatibility. But when it comes to PMCF, we're talking clinical safety performance.
Perfect. There seems to be a lot of questions around calculating sample size. So I'm going to ask another one here for you. So along the logic of calculating sample size for surveys of medical device, because devices are sold to hospitals through distributors in some cases, and it is not known how many DRs or doctors are using that device, or some devices are used many times by one doctor.
Okay.
Yeah.
The rule is the same. So how you're selling your product doesn't impact how you're going to be justifying your performance. That's your issue. So if you're selling your devices through distributors and you don't have access to end users, that's an issue that you need to solve. If the only way you can get data is to actually access the doctors somehow, you need to determine the sample size based on what you're trying to achieve with your survey. When you've reached or found that number, which might be 100, you need to find ways to actually approach the end users that can provide you with the information that you need.
So just to be crystal clear with that one, the regulatory bodies care about who is manufacturing the product, right? They don't care about how you're selling it. It's on the manufacturer to obtain that clinical data.
Yeah,
okay.
Exactly.
Good. Great. Okay, if you produce a Class 2A product which has sufficient history in the market and no adverse events or residual risk relating to clinical impact, do you have to have a PMCF plan for the product?
According to the regulation, all device classes need a PMCF plan. Depending on what your PMCF plan states, you might or might not need to initiate PMCF methods or activities. Still, by stating that your device had no adverse events and no residual risks sounds still, well, there are devices that don't have any, or very few, but I heard a notified body tell me the other day, or a representative from a notified body say that when he hears that, he starts challenging it and asking, how do you know? Can you justify that? And by stating, oh, we haven't received any reports, that's not good enough. You need to proactively illustrate that. So if you proactively have been able to illustrate that, you might be able to base your PMCF plan on that fact, and that thus minimize the activity that you need to initiate.
Great. post-market clinical required for class 1 devices?
Yes, PMCF plan. So I've had this, this was the part of the presentation where I had like an overview of all the report requirements. So PMCF plan is a requirement for class 1 devices, but again, it might be very, very simple and not needing any or few activities to be initiated.
Okay. I just had another question come in through actually through email. How can you determine the sample size when the standard deviation of a device is unknown? So when a countertop feasibility study is not possible to determine this standard deviation.
Then you can sometimes refer to similar device studies or similar studies out there in the market or publications that have some kind of similarity to a device or within the same area to determine that. So if you're, for example, conducting a study on blood pressure, you could probably take some kind of a golden standard measurement or standard deviation from that area and then apply that to yours.
Great. Okay, another question here from before the webinar. PMCF study versus survey. For a survey, do you pay the principal? Okay, so there's going to be a bunch of questions. I'm asking one at a time for you.
Yeah.
Do you pay the principal investigators or PI for data entered/collected?
Depends. That solely depends on your clinical expert strategy. There are cases where I've heard companies doing that. There are cases where I've heard of companies not doing that. Some companies are using scare tactics. By not providing us with the clinical data we need, we might be forced to pull the product off market. Would you like that? No. Well, then help us. Or, would you want to become a part of our clinical excellence team, influencing the product development or participate in publications? There are multiple ways of doing this. So this is something that needs to be included in your clinical expert or key opinion leader strategy.
Great. Yeah, and I could just say from Project MedTech consulting side of things, we've seen a pretty even mixture of both of this. Some that are paid, some that aren't. So I think it's your point's valid or specifically relevant is with just having planned for it. The second part of that question is, do you have one file CRF for one patient or one file for one PI?
So a CRF stands for case report form. And then the traditional terms, the case report forms is referring to one case. So it's a report form or a set of forms on a single case. Throughout the years, the terminology has just been mixed up quite a lot. So usually you just have, depending on the device, you usually have one case report form for one case. And if you're asking the clinical experts or the doctors questions on their experiences, in the most traditional sense, that would not be a case report form. That would be a clinical experience questionnaire or a clinical experience form.
Okay, great. We have 3 more questions that had come in previously, and then you could be off the hot seat unless some other ones roll in here. So special interest in PMCF clinical data for medical devices without producing any data. For example, dialysis supply panel or dialysis permeate ring main. Any ideas beside from literature, customer feedback, etc.?
So this is a pretty interesting case because there are a number of devices out there in the market right now today that are considered medical devices, but they might never touch a patient. They might be accessories or add-ons to a system of some sort that is classified as a medical device. And there are ways to document that there is not enough there's not enough safety risk to determine that you need to collect the clinical data on specifically that device, but there might be performance tests that you might need to conduct. For example, if we're talking about dialysis supply parts of a larger medical device or the parts of a larger medical device that does something about dialysis, you might need to be able to demonstrate that your device performs as intended. And that could, for example, be done through lab tests. You might not need to conduct a clinical study to do that, because you don't necessarily need a human subject to measure the flow or pressure. So that's where you have to start thinking like an engineer, like how do I break my medical device up in pieces which suffice the PMCF requirements? And for this kind of device, I would probably state you probably can in some ways document that PMCF activities can be limited to a bare minimum.
Okay, great. What information should be included in a PMCF survey? I think you've kind of addressed some of that, but can the patient's name be included? I think that was a specific part of this question.
Yeah, there's nothing in the data protection regulations in Europe that prohibits anybody to provide their name or email or mobile number. It's just like what everybody does in the banking world or the airline world. So if you have the right consent in place, you can do that. If you have a patient signing off on, yes, I'm providing with my name, it can be included. But you have to state why you need that. You need to have a legal reason. That's the main concept of the GDPR. You need to have a reason for why you're collecting that. And if it's for purposes of demonstrating clinical performance, then yeah, but when do you need a name to demonstrate clinical performance? So it's a question of data protection requirements.
Great.
Whether or not you need it or not.
Okay. So another question came in, and it's my former colleagues at NAMSA who are asking the questions. Can you explain why NBs or notified bodies are wanting benefit and risk acceptance rates in the CEP ahead of the CER? And this is also with an asterisk of it might be unrelated, but if you can't answer that, feel free. If not, we could just move on.
I believe it's because they don't want you to be documenting things backwards. They don't want you to be calculating the ratio backwards. They want you to determine a success ratio of some sort. Just like for example, when we're validating our software, every single time we're updating our software, we state that we need to be able to have these few bugs in the software to be able to release it. The same thing goes for risk-benefit ratios. If the risk-benefit ratio is determined before, and then you reach that level, you can accept it. However, if you start by reaching some level and then you state that you're going to be reaching that level, you're doing it all backwards. So in scientific means, I would much rather rely on a device where somebody stated that they're going to reach 100 and they actually did, instead of somebody that reached 60 and then told everybody that, yeah, 60 was all what we were after. So okay. I think that's the main reason. They don't want you to work backwards.
Okay. Another good question just came in as well. So is a retrospective study sufficient for clinical study for class 3 legacy devices? Should prospective studies be done? If a retrospective study is sufficient, is a patient informed consent required?
The trouble with retrospective data collection is that you cannot rely on the data quality being as up to the level of GCP. So you can't simply just ask a hospital to send you a CSV file with all the clinical data you need and then just use that. Where that data came from, who entered it, at what time point, what did anything change, were there errors checks made on those fields, stuff like that. All that needs to be taken into account. So if you're just basing your data on retrospective collection, which is coming from who knows who, quality assurance departments, it's not up to the standard that is required for the MDR. So you might need to initiate prospective studies. However, there can be data in those retrospective data collections that could be used. Again, that's generic. That would probably be considered a general method, and that needs to be supported with some kind of a specific method, for example.
Great. One more question that come in ahead of time. Which PMCF activities could be of relevance for Class 2A and B, especially when no gaps are present? And the follow-up to that is, can the PMCF activities be included in the proactive PMS activities?
So if there are no gaps at all, you can probably suffice with proactive literature review and maybe some clinical experience surveys. Just make sure that safety and performance is up to date and up to the level that you expected it to be. Updating it accordingly with the requirement, reporting requirement specifications annually or every other year. And the last part, can the PMCF activities be included in the proactive PMS activities? Yes, definitely. So a lot of the companies that we're talking to and supporting with PMCF are including safety vigilance questions, for example, in their data collection, because it's a very good way of asking the same profiles, the same people, the questions that are relevant for safety as well.
Great. So that was all the canned questions, and we actually got through all the questions that were asked. It feels this is the first one in a while. I felt like I was you were like defending your dissertation for your master's or PhD. So I appreciate you bearing with us and answering everybody's questions. I think it was great. In closing, is there anything you want to add in closing that we hadn't yet covered or you want to finish with?
Yeah. If there's anything I want to share with people, that it's think logically. Regulatory is nothing but logic. Continuing guessing and stating that you think or might want doesn't do any good. But looking at it from a logical perspective is usually the best way to go about it. And trusting your guts. I mean, if you've read the regulation, you read the guidances, you know your device, taking one step at a time and doing it in a logical order is the best way to go forward.
Great. Well, listen, I appreciate you giving this presentation on a pretty sensitive topic, just knowing on how much change there is, and it's a pretty hot topic in the industry. Thanks everyone for listening in and tuning in and sending questions in. With that being said, thanks for joining the 23rd, I believe it was, installment of the Galen Data webinar series, and we'll see you next month.